are you optimistic? Do you believe that the current economic, political, and corporate system would allow a new, fairer, and more sustainable system to be born, or would it be just stillbirth?
Rutger.
You know, I'm not an optimist, but I'm not a pessimist either. To me, optimism sounds a little bit like complacency, where you say, you know, things will turn out to be all right, don't worry. The future will be rich and happy. But you don't have to be a pessimist either. I think you can be hopeful about the future. Hope is about the possibility of change, and it impels you to act. Now, again, if we zoom out a little bit, and if we look at what's been happening in the past 10 years, we've seen that ideas that used to be dismissed as unrealistic, unreasonable, crazy, they've moved into the mainstream. Think about higher taxes on the rich, a universal basic income to completely eradicate poverty, a more activist role for the state to tackle the great threats of our time, such as climate change. I mean, 10 years ago, that was dismissed as lunacy. But now, if you read, in April, there was an editorial from the Financial Times, not exactly a left-wing publication, but even they said that we need to think about all these things, higher taxes on the rich, a universal basic income. And I think that this year can be, the shifting point where everything changes. Indeed, crises make you remember really important things. They lay bare what's really wrong with society. So, for example, if we've learned this year who the real wealth creators are. Turns out that these so-called essential jobs, you look at the lists that have been published around the globe, and the hedge fund managers are not on there. We're talking about teachers, nurses, care workers, you name it, who are doing the really important work. If they go on strike, we're in trouble.
That's right.
So I hope that this year could be a shifting year where we move into a new zeitgeist. And that's also what I see when I look at a new generation. There's still an old political class in power, who are 50 or 60 years old. They grew up in the era of the Cold War. And that's how they see the world in black and white. Like, they talk about capitalism versus communism, for example. But again, if we zoom out and if we look at the younger generation, at the millennials and Generation Z, here we have the most ethnically diverse, most progressive, most highly educated generation in the history of the world that looks at things very differently. When they say, "Ooh, that's communism, that's socialism," we say whatever. We just are more open to new ideas, and that really gives me hope. It doesn't make me an optimist, but it does give me hope.
And I'll tell you what I think. This is what I believe. If you think back on American history, and you think about the real changes that have taken place in society, you think about the labor movement and working class people standing up and saying to their employers, we're not going to be treated like animals anymore. You can't hire and fire us. You can't work us, 15 hours a day. We deserve dignity. And you think about the growth of the labor movement, of millions of people beginning to stand together and fight. You think about the civil rights movement, and it wasn't just Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was, again, millions of African Americans and their white allies saying, we're going to end segregation and racism in this country. Think about the women's movement. 100 years ago, women in America didn't even have the right to vote. Think about the gay rights movement. Think about the environmental. The only way that change takes place is when ordinary people come together and stand up and fight and say that the status quo is not working. And that's what I believe, and that's what we're trying to do.